1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a certain man whose name was Elkanah, and he was an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was Hannah, the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his town to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and all her daughters, but to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival Peninnah used to provoke her severely to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year after year, and as often as she went up into the house of the Lord, she used to provoke Hannah. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. And now Eli was the priest who was sitting at the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord, and Hannah was deeply distressed and prayed to God and wept bitterly. She made a vow, "O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me and not forget me, but if you will give your servant a male child, I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink no wine and no razor shall touch his head." As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah was praying silently, only her lips were moving, and her voice was not heard, so Eli thought she was drunk. Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord. I am a woman deeply troubled. I have neither drunk strong wine or any strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before God. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." And then the woman went to her quarters and ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We like clean lines. We like sharp edges. We like defined roles. This is where you fit. We coach our children to have career goals in junior high and internships before they graduate from high school. This is who you will be. We need to know who to blame when things go wrong and who to reward when things go well. This is who is responsible. We like pain to have a diagnosis, a name. This is your treatment protocol. We want our heroes and our villains to be obvious. This is good, and this is evil. We prefer effects to have obvious causes. This is the way the world works. We like clean lines. We like sharp edges. We like defined roles. Which explains why we become so unhappy when the lines around us blur and fade into nothing. We study and we sacrifice and we graduate with honors, and then there are no jobs to be had. And so we labor in back rooms of fast food restaurants for minimum wage. We choose baby names and create Pinterest boards, and we track our fertility cycles, and then those who want children the most never have them. We vow to love each other till death do us part, and then we go to couples counseling and we struggle to hold on to the slipping threads of our marriages. Then we walk out of divorce courts with documents in hand. We like clean lines. We like sharp edges. We like defined roles. But somehow the markers we try to draw our lines with always turn out to be washable. There were clean lines and sharp edges and defined roles around Hannah. Women and their lives and their bodies were matters of economic importance. Traded from father to husband in exchange for money or land or livestock or a combination of all those three, women were the way that the future was established and legacy was rooted, but never with their permission. There was only one acceptable path to be a woman in this time, a virgin in her father's house until she was a fertile wife bearing sons in her husband's. Anything else was a reason for shame and judgment. A woman with no children, a woman with no sons, she was destined to be forgotten, destined to be put aside, and to die with no marker on her grave. Hannah had no children, no sons, and she stood outside the clean lines and sharp edges and defined roles of her people. The woman who should have shown her the most understanding and mercy, Peninnah, instead ruthlessly mocked her infertility. The man who should have understood her well-founded fear and grief at her barrenness, her husband Elkanah, well, he managed to make her grief about him. And the priest, who should have recognized prayer when he saw it, Eli, instead misunderstood her deeply troubled prayer and berated her for drunkenness. Hannah was not the first woman to know the grief of standing outside of the people she had always thought she was on the inside with. But now, she was alone. But what does Hannah and her tears have to do with hope? In the beginning of our lives, hope is frenetic energy, like Mary Tyler Moore spinning in the street, throwing her hat up into the air. I'm not so young that I don't get that reference. Hope early on is the shining face of the high school graduate surrounded by a proud family. And then hope becomes instead quiet determination, gritting our teeth against the frustrating obstacles that always seem to land at our feet, like the young lawyer who takes pro bono cases to try to defend people against giant corporations. And then hope becomes the gasp of air before you go under the waves of a life that never seems to let you stand very long before it knocks you down again. Like the single mother who expertly coupons and manages to stretch $50 to feed a family of 4 for a week. And then sometimes hope is only a sob that God alone can hear. The father in a hospital who clings to the sleeping body of a child who is covered by one too many wires. Somehow the path of human life meanders in such a way that we all find ourselves at the side of Hannah as she weeps at the shrine of Shiloh. Perhaps this is the only place we can learn what hope is, when we meet Hannah at Shiloh. 1 Samuel begins where the book of Judges has ended, and it has ended in blood, stories of descending chaos and corruption. The tribes of Israel had been led by incredible judges like Deborah and Gideon, but by the end of the recounting, their leaders are nameless wretches who murder their concubines to make political points. And out of that darkness, the first person we meet is Hannah. Hannah is a foreshadowing of the stories that will come of how God does not choose those with power and privilege to make his will known. She is a hint of how God acts subversively in the lives of people to make right what they put wrong. But Hannah is also a figure with no power. And she unfairly carries this cultural blame and shame for her barrenness, where you see barrenness was always the fault of the woman. She had every reason to be embittered towards the God who had been silent to all of her prayers all of those years long gone. And yet, in the deepest part of her grief, the only place she goes is to meet God at Shiloh. In our Friday morning book club, we've been reading What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Jewishness of Jesus by a rabbi named Evan Moffick. And in the chapter that dealt with the last days of Jesus, he spends time reflecting on why Jesus cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And rather than be unsettled by Jesus' despair and accusation towards God, Rabbi Moffick places it in the context of incredibly similar prayers of David, of Moses, even of Abraham. And Rabbi Moffick says this: a child cries because he or she knows a parent will respond. A cry of despair is not a proclamation of disbelief. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes a cry of despair, of questioning, is the best evidence of God's presence. It seems that grief and hope are closer together than we think. The clean lines and sharp edges that we think separate them actually growing blurry and dull. Hannah's tears are not a source of shame, as Eli mistakes them to be. They are not an emotion to be dismissed or explained away like her husband tries to do. Hannah weeps in the presence of God because she believes and she knows that she is heard. Her lips move and her heart pounds because beneath all the grief, hope lingers like fog on heavy mountains. Hannah, despite years of barrenness and mockery, still believes that God has the power to give her a child. Her hope is weeping hope, but it is still hope. And her weeping hope alters the world, because Hannah does bear a son, Samuel. And Samuel will anoint David to be king. And David is the beginning of the line that leads to Jesus. Friends, we have begun Advent, the season of preparing ourselves for Jesus. For Christians, the new year has begun, and it begins with hope. But this hope is not bright-eyed optimism. This hope looks more like Hannah, bowed over in prayer at Shiloh. The lines here, where spirit and flesh meet, where hope and grief dance together, are not clean lines. They are not sharp edges. Here in this place, we have no illusions about the world we live in, do we? We do not lie to ourselves about the state of the world, about the state of our own lives. We know things go wrong. We know that people make mistakes. We know that death stalks and that injustice rolls like the poisoned waters of Flint, Michigan. But the hope of Advent is the hope that remains despite everything that is broken. It is the hope of one small candle in the middle of dark places. It is the hope of just enough bread for one more meal. It is the hope of a phone call in the middle of a night from a friend you hadn't heard of, and forever. It is one prayer, one more prayer, after years of unanswered ones. It is hope that manifests itself in tears. And that is powerful hope. It was the hope that Hannah had for a child. It was the hope that Israel had, that one day they would return from exile. It was the hope of the first century Jews that the Messiah would finally come, and it is our hope too. Hope like Hannah's is the hope that will carry us through the days when we are mocked for what we are or for what we are not. Hope like Hannah will carry us through the days when well-meaning friends will try to minimize our grief or silence us. Hope like Hannah's will carry through the days when our tears are mistaken or mislabeled as ungrateful or complaining or drunken. Hope like Hannah's carries us to Shiloh. And at Shiloh, we meet God. And when we meet God, well, everything changes. Advent has begun. God is blurring the lines between heaven and earth. The defined roles of creator and creature are fading into each other. A mystery is ready to bloom. Hope is reborn in the midst of hopeless people. So in this season, do not insist upon anything, and do not be surprised if you see tears in the faces of those you know. And certainly do not sin by mocking those who mourn. The ones who weep may be at Shiloh already, may be at the side of Hannah, who teaches them that in their tears God hears them and that God's love turns fully towards them. Do you have need of Shiloh? Hannah waits for you to teach you what hope can look like, to how hope can be born even as you weep. Pray with me.